Hi guys, Olive here today to talk to you about the books I read in April 2020. This was probably the most successful reading month that I have ever had. Not only did I read more books during the month of April than I ever have in a single month before, but I also reviewed a good number of them. In my typical fashion, I'm going to start off by talking about all of those books that I have not previously discussed at length elsewhere, and then I'm going to follow that up with some chat about the books that I did review this month. I'll start off by talking about my 5-star nonfiction prediction for the month of April. That was How to Be a Good Creature by Cy Montgomery. This is a collection of essays about different animals that entered the author's life at different times and because of different reasons. So one essay is about a pig that lived with her family and that charmed the entire neighborhood. Another one is about a very gentle tarantula that Cy Montgomery and a team of scientists encountered when they were on an expedition. A few different essays in here are about the different dogs that Cy Montgomery has had throughout her life. In each of these essays, she talks about the relationship she had with each of these animals and ultimately what those relationships taught her about being the best, most authentic version of herself. I think anyone who's ever had a real deep connection with an animal will fall in love with this book. I was so touched by so much of what I read in here, and it just made me love Cy Montgomery all the more. She is so charming, so lovable, and there's not a trace of ego there. I love her so much, and I loved this book. 5 stars. Right on the money. I'm really happy I started off the month like that because the next 2 books I read, the next 2 ones I'm going to talk about, I was very disappointed by. The first of those 2 is If Then by Kate Hope Day. This book follows a group of neighbors in Oregon who start seeing visions of themselves living in parallel realities. So one of these neighbors is a surgeon. Another one is stepping into her recently deceased mother's shoes and is working as a real estate agent. One is a new mom and a former philosophy student, and the last one is a scientist who is studying animal behaviors in response to volcanic activity. It's clear the author was going for some kind of a novelization of the idea of parallel universes, which is a huge concept, but it basically means that if one thing would have happened differently, then the universe would have gone down a different divergent path, and the parallel universe theory suggests that both of those realities exist simultaneously. So just for example, if this character's mother hadn't died, that's a reality. If this character had given birth to a boy instead of a girl, that's another reality. There's also a reality that contains both of those things. So that's the idea the author was going for, yet at the same time, there is a dormant volcano sitting just outside of the town that is looming over all of them. Introducing a dormant volcano into the story and then underscoring it several different times as the story progresses is Chekhov's gun. You already know what's going to happen. The book spoils itself. And even though the author writes this whole book around this huge concept of parallel universes, there's no real sense of opinion. Like, what are you trying to say by writing a whole book about this idea? If that's not clear, then the author has not done her job. I will say I really liked the surgeon sections. I found that they were very reminiscent of the early, aka the only good seasons of Grey's Anatomy, but I really like everything relating to surgery, so that was kind of a freebie. If you've not read this book yet, I would highly recommend that you remain in that universe. I was also majorly let down by a book that I pre-ordered, which just makes the sting all the worse. That book was This Lovely City by Louise Hare. I pre-ordered this book because it is set in post-World War II London, and it follows a jazz musician both before and after he discovers a dead body. I immediately thought, oh my god, rules of civility in London plus a murder mystery? I'm in. But that's not how it turned out. It started off well enough. Our main character, Laurie, is part of the Windrush generation, which was a name given to an unknown number of people from the Caribbean who were recruited by the British government to emigrate and help rebuild the country after World War II essentially wiped out an entire generation of men. Laurie was one of the first to arrive in 1948, and he quickly discovered that the government press releases and newspaper articles written welcoming them to London were not going to be echoed by many Londoners. This book depicts a lot of the racial tensions and the abuses that Laurie and his compatriots had to suffer through. Things only get worse for them when Laurie is one of 2 people to discover a dead, dark-skinned toddler. Fingers are immediately pointed at Laurie and then his fellow immigrants, considering the race of the baby and also the neighborhood in which it was discovered. This story has the potential to be so incredible, but the execution was so poor. It devolves very quickly into a weak character novel that resembles a soap soap opera more than anything else. Instead of anything deep or even interesting, this story is mainly about how this murder investigation interrupts Laurie's pursuit of his lady love, the girl next door, the girl with some skeletons in her own closet. To put it simply, this book had no soul to it. Laurie is a jazz musician. He plays clarinet. He loves doing it. He wants to make his entire living off of playing music, and yet there's barely any music in this book. You can't do that to me. If this is a book about a jazz musician, I want to hear some jazz. There's nothing in the way of atmosphere, and there's nothing in the way of deeper meaning beyond just the history that this author sculpted into this story. She chooses to focus solely on the few main characters to the detriment of every other aspect in this book. I'm grateful to this book for introducing me to the history of the Windrush generation, but it let me down in pretty much every way. But at the end of the month, I did read a book that made me extremely happy. That book was I Love You So Muchi by Sarah Kuhn. I first picked this one up after I saw someone on my Goodreads feed post about it. I immediately had to tell my husband because he hates cutesy puns and I needed him to hear it. When I told him the title of this book, his eyes nearly rolled out of his head. That pretty much sealed the deal for me. I knew I had to get the ebook out of the library and read it immediately because that would annoy him even more, because that's what you do when you're married. As the title would suggest, this is really, really cute. It is all about an Asian American high school girl who is an artist. She's been painting pretty much her entire life, partially because her mother is also a painter, but she's fallen out of love with painting recently and she doesn't quite know how to tell her mom. She doesn't want to let her down. It's during this period of uncertainty in her life when she's wondering what precisely she's going to pursue in her life if she's not going to be a painter like she always thought she would be, that she gets a letter from her grandparents in Japan. These are her mother's parents, from whom her mother has been estranged for the past 20 years, and they want their granddaughter to come visit them in Kyoto over her spring break. She decides to go, of course, and while she's there for 2 weeks, she explores the city, she meets a cute boy in a mochi costume, and she starts to discover that her calling may have been under her nose this whole time. It's a really sweet little YA book. It's very authentically teenager in those feelings of confusion about trying to figure out what you want to do with your life at such a young age, but it leaves off all the angst in favor of self-discovery. If you're looking for a comfort read, this is a great one. A book that I weirdly took comfort in this month was Still by Emma Hansen. This is a new grief memoir that came out at the beginning of April. It is all about how the author, on the day before her due date, found out that the baby she was carrying had died and that she would have to deliver her firstborn child still. That tragic event happens very early on in this book, and the rest of the book is essentially about their grieving process. Everything she and her husband did to honor the son they never got a chance to have, and attempt to find a way to keep on living in the wake of his loss. Obviously, this book is heartbreaking. I was a mess when I was reading the beginning sections, but like I said before, I oddly found companionship within this book. I actually wrote a post on my long dormant blog about how I found echoes of my own grief about this whole global situation within this book, and how reading this book at that time in my life allowed me to feel those fully. I'll link that post for you down below if you would like to read it. I am hoping to post on my blog semi-regularly. I'm hoping to get back on track, but we'll see how it goes. Now on to all the books I have reviewed elsewhere. I'm going to say a few words about each of them to give you a general idea of what they're about, and then I will point you in the direction of my review if any of them pique your interest. First, let me mention the 2 books I reviewed for the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette this month. The first of those 2 is If I Had Your Face by Frances Cha, a debut novel set in South Korea. It follows 4 very different women living in the same apartment building, and it shifts between their perspectives as we learn about the hardships within their backgrounds, as well as their present challenges. Overall, this was a really impressive debut. I will link my review of it down below if you'd like to hear more about it. I actually did a fair amount of research on beauty standards in South Korea in order to be able to write it. I love that the mildly obsessive internet searches I do about pretty much every book I read get to now be called research for my review. What a rebrand. The other one I wrote up for the Post-Gazette is The Unsuitable by Molly Polig, another debut novel for debut novel season. This is a dark Victorian novel following a young woman approaching spinsterhood age who believes that her mother, who died giving birth to her, lives in a scar on her neck and speaks to her. The premise of this book was far more intriguing than the execution. If you'd like to hear more of my thoughts on it, I'll link that review down below as well. And then I read 2 gentle true crime books, The Man Who Loved Books Too Too Much by Allison Hoover Bartlett, all about a man who stole books of all kinds from book dealers, and The Orchid Thief by Susan Orlean, all about the theft of rare orchids from the state of Florida. I read both of these books ahead of a recommendations video I did for non-murder true crime books. I talk more expansively about both of these books within that video, so I will link it for you down below if you're intrigued by one or both of these books. And then I made the very spontaneous decision to do an entire week of review videos. I started out that week of reviews by talking about The Enchanted April by Elizabeth von Arnim, the classic feel-good novel set in the 1920s, in which 4 dissatisfied women, all strangers, decide to rent a castle together in Italy for the entire month of April. The book is delightful, as is its movie adaptation. I discuss both and compare the two in a video that I will link down below. I went on to review the new nonfiction book Hidden Valley Road by Robert Kolker, the story of a family who had 12 children, 6 of whom were eventually diagnosed with schizophrenia. It's an impressive combination of science and family saga, but I did and still do have some questions about the role the author played within the story. I explain what I mean by that in my review video, which I will link for you down below. Next up, I reviewed what is now a new favorite, that is historical fiction novel The Signature of All Things by Elizabeth Gilbert. This is an epic character study of a lady botanist, and it is beyond gorgeous. Again, my full review will be linked down below. I then did the next installment in my What's the Story Wishbone series on my classics pick for the month, which was The Three Musketeers by Alexandre Dumas. It's a book that I can appreciate for what it is, but one that I didn't really enjoy all that much. I think it's far too long, and that's probably why the Wishbone writers abbreviated it as heavily as they did. If you'd like to see what I mean by that, I will link my video down below. I then had the privilege of reviewing one of the best romance books I have ever read, To Have and to Hoax by Martha Waters. This is a Regency romance all about an estranged married couple who work past their problems by means of tricking one another. If you like romance or are interested in giving romance a try, I highly encourage you to watch my review, which is also linked below. In order to educate myself more about this global pandemic situation that we're all dealing with right now, I read and reviewed Spillover by David Quammen, which is a book all about zoonoses, or infections that transfer from the animal kingdom to humans. It's an impressive work, but I did have a few minor gripes about the organization. If you'd like to learn more, my review is, of course, linked below. And then I closed out that epic week of reviews with a dual review of 2 new books inspired by Jane Austen. Miss Austen by Jill Hornby follows Cassandra Austen, Jane Austen's sister, 20 years after the death of the author, and we see Cassandra read through some of her sister's old letters and decide which ones to destroy. And The Other Bennet Sister by Janice Hadlow both retells portions of Pride and Prejudice from Mary's perspective and imagines a whole life for her after the events of the beloved classic. I liked both, but I did think one was a little bit more interesting than the other. If you'd like to hear which one that is, I will put a link to that review down below. So that was the massive list of books that I finished during the month of April. Basically all I'm doing is reading right now, so I anticipate that May will be another big month. Please do let me know if you've read any of these books, if you've heard of any of these books, or if you're now interested in reading any of these books after hearing me talk about them. You can put that or any other more general comments or questions you may have down in the comment section below, but you can also find me on a variety of different places on social media, and the links to all of my profiles will be in the description box below. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you are having a wonderful day, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.